That was the fabulous voice of Sandra Piscini, who is, as many of you know, a long-time member of the Magdalena Project, and she wrote this song to celebrate the 30 years of the Magdalena Project in 2016. And this year we're celebrating the 35th year of the Magdalena Project. And tonight we are also enjoying the first ever online Magdalena Festival, Bodies on Live. So my name is Helen Varley Jamison, and I really warmly welcome you to this evening that we have a lot of wonderful things ahead of us. So I will just quickly do the housekeeping that we need to do before we go further. We ask you all to keep your video muted, that is not showing your camera unless you're asked, and also to keep your audio muted as well. Ask questions or make comments in the chat. Please use headphones if you can for the best quality. And if you haven't already, you can check hide non-video participants in your Zoom settings to get the best experience. I'd like to thank the team who have brought this festival to us all. Many of us are here tonight. I'm the host of the meeting tonight, and Christina is the Zoomer. And then we have also
Bodies on Live. I think that's the name of the
somebody's
festival.
Somebody needs to be muted. I will just mute you. We've got translation for the second part of the evening from Irlanda.
From Eugenia, sorry. You're
muted again.
Unable to start the video. Why was that?
Okay, something is happening there.
You just said because, but you.
The host has stopped it.
Okay, Christina, can you mute the people
country?
that are not muted? Because I think when I muted them, I ended up muting myself. So we have tonight 3 events in this block. The first one is Gilly Adams' performance, Mrs Blister Changes Boots. After that, we have got Meet the Magdalenas, which is an informal gathering with many of the founding or long-time members of the Magdalena Project Network. So this is an opportunity for us all to have a glass of wine and chat with them and ask questions and hear from them their stories. And we're going to finish the evening with a concert from Meg Ella. It's called Something Old, Something Borrowed, Something New. And Meg is one of the younger generations of the Magdalena Project. So we have a nice generational flow to our program this evening. So I would like to introduce the first performance. Gilly Adams is one of the founders, one of the founding members of the Magdalena Network. She was right there at the beginning when it all started with the first festival in Cardiff in 1986. And the piece that Gilly is going to present, Mrs Blister Changes Boots, is a storytelling performance that Julia Varley invited her to give at the Transit Festival in 2019. And she has now turned this into a storytelling piece for Zoom. So we can now sit back and enjoy Mrs Blister Changes Boots with Gilly Adams.
The road seen, then not seen. The hillside hiding, then revealing the way you should take. The road dropping away from you as if leaving you to walk on thin air. Then catching you, holding you up when you thought you would fall. And the way forward always in the end, the way that you followed, the way that carried you into your future, that brought you to this place, no matter that it sometimes took your promise from you, no matter that it had to break your heart along the way. The sense of having walked from far inside yourself out into the revelation, to have risked yourself for something that seemed to stand both inside you and far beyond you, that called you back to the only road in the end you could follow, walking as you did in your rags of love and speaking in the voice that by night became a prayer for safe arrival, so that one day you realized that what you wanted had already happened long ago, and in the dwelling place you had lived in before you began, and that every step along the way you had carried the heart and the mind and the promise that first set you off and drew you on, and that you were more marvelous in your simple wish to find a way than the gilded roofs of any destination you could reach, as if all along you had thought the end point might be a city with golden towers and cheering crowds, and turning the corner at what you thought was the end of the road, you found just a simple reflection and a clear revelation beneath the face looking back, and beneath it another invitation, all in one glimpse, like a person and a place you had sought forever, like a broad field of freedom that beckoned you beyond, like another life, and the road still stretching on. So, isn't it strange what we remember and what we don't remember? I've reached an age where I can scarcely tell you what I did yesterday, let alone last week. And yet, there are some things that stay with us. And the poem I just read you is the words of the American poet David White, and it's a poem called Santiago, which I found in his book Pilgrim, 5 years after I'd actually walked the Camino. And something about what he says seemed to sum up everything that I felt. And here I am, it's almost 10 years since I walked it, and yet I find myself still reflecting, still thinking about it, still asking questions about what it meant. And so I'm going to tell you, a bit like the ancient mariner who stopped 1 in 3, and it looks like I'm stopping 1 in 43. I'm going to stop and tell you my story about the Camino and what it meant to you, what it meant to me, what it meant to me. And I'm going to begin, in order to do that, I have to introduce you to Mrs. Blister. Now, I wish I could bring Mrs. Blister on stage. You know, she could enter left, and were she to enter left, I'm sure she'd want to be seen at her best. She'd like to be seen in a rather nice sun hat and perhaps something fetching, something good for the older woman to walk along. But in fact, Mrs. Blister doesn't look like that at all. She is cross. That's her defining feature. She's cross and she's grumpy. She's wearing a distinctly unbecoming pair of shorts, rather clumpy walking boots, socks. She's got walker's tan, you know, between the knees and the ankles and the top, you know, after the top bit of the arms, and the face all burnt. She's got her pack on her back, and she has got her walking poles, and she is stomping along. And as she goes, she is muttering. Moan, mutter, heavy pack, aching back, blisters. Moan, mutter, heavy pack, aching back, blisters. Mrs. Blister's lament. So I'm going to invite you to keep an image of Mrs. Blister in your mind's eye as I tell you my story. And remember that she was with me all the way. So to begin, as Dylan Thomas said, at the beginning, or really not at the beginning, but at the beginning of the part of the story that I want to tell you. It's day 35, and I'm in a place called Las Herreras in northern Spain, and I've arrived in this place by walking across some very dangerous roads and then through a long, dark, thin valley, which was dominated and overshadowed by the highest, nastiest viaduct I have ever seen. Now, If I'd walked a little bit further, I might have arrived at Routelan, and at Routelan, I might have had a better supper and a bit of a massage. And if I'd stopped earlier at La Farbe, rumor has it that feet would have been washed and a few prayers said. But it's all random, and I'm not in either of those places. I'm actually here in Las Herrerias. And the company is random too in the way of these things. So there's Maria. She's Spanish. She's one of the few Catholics I meet along the way. She works for the EU and she volunteers every year for Sister Teresa. And then there's a rather sallow, quiet, older Korean woman. And of course she's quiet because we don't have a common language, but somehow I discovered that she's actually a nursing sister and that she's been brought to Spain by reading the books of Paulo Coelho. And then the other person is Hanneke. Hanneke is a Dutch school teacher, and I have to say she does feature in dispatches. So you'll probably hear about her as we go on. And the first thing that happens is that the young Spanish woman whose hostel this is rushes out and looks at us and says, "Any insects?" And we all say, "No." But we know what she's talking about because bed bugs are ubiquitous along the way. And so she's checking on that. So she welcomes us in. It's small, it's dark. And I'm having a very bad day, and so is Mrs. Blister. So I go into the corner of the room. I found the darkest, cornerest bed, and I put my pack down. And then I decide, actually, I don't have the energy or the desire to speak to any of my companions. I'm feeling so miserable. And I go outside and I sit in the sunshine and I contemplate and I moan and mutter to myself. And then I remember that it's my Aunt Margaret's birthday, 84, I think. And Margaret, she's not only my aunt, she's my godmother, and she is the last remaining member of that generation of the family. And she is my father's sister, and I'm very fond of her. So I ring her up and I wish her happy birthday, and I try to be jolly and I tell her where I am and what I'm doing, and she's delighted to hear from me. And I thought it would cheer me up, but it doesn't. And I'm just as miserable. In fact, makes me more homesick. And I sit there and I just would like to be anywhere else in the world. And here is the first stone for my shrine, the first stone from my walk to keep. What are you doing, you may ask? Well, I am walking the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain. I am walking for 500 miles from Roncesvalles in the east at the Pyrenees to Santiago de Compostela in the west. So as long as I walk with the sun behind me, there's a reasonable chance that I won't get lost because I'll be pointing in the right direction. And in any case, this is the way of St. James. And St. James's symbol is the scallop shell. And handily and helpfully, at many places on the ground, on walls, yellow scallop shells have been painted. So you know you're going in the right direction. And I have a kind of fantasy idea that in front of me is a very nice, kind Spanish man with a pot of yellow paint, and that he's rushing ahead to make sure that I don't get lost, and he's signposting the way. And I've taken the trouble to accumulate the kind of kit that a pilgrim needs. First off is my Pilgrim's Passport. Now, this passport is seriously useful. It allows me to get into a hostel every evening, and it allows me to get into a hostel which is very, very cheap. And every day, every time I go to a hostel, or indeed where I go anywhere with a cafe or whatever, I don't think you can see this very well, but you get a lovely stamp for wherever you've been. And they're very pretty, they're all very different. And the point of all the stamps is that when I get to Santiago and show my passport, it will prove that I've done what I've said. I haven't cheated. I've actually been in all these places. All the stamps are dated, and I've been there, got my stamp, proved that I've done it. The next thing, the next useful item is my guidebook. Now, my guidebook is written by a man called Mr. Brierley. And Mr. Brierley is ubiquitous. I think he must have the monopoly on all of this, because everywhere I go, I see his guidebook in many, many different languages. And it's pretty useful as guidebooks go. It's got pictures of places along the way. It divides the route and tells you how far to go in a day. It suggests places you might stay along the way. But unfortunately, Mr. Brierley, in my opinion, has got a little bit above himself. And this is an English joke, is he's a bit Radio 4, he's a bit thought for the day. So you get so far with some useful information from Mr. Brierley, and then he writes things like, everywhere there are fountains. Some contain refreshing drinking water to hydrate the body, others wine to fortify it. Offered without any expectation of anything in return. I am showered with generosity. I leave these signs of service with this gift. Sanctimonious gift. Much, much more useful is this plain sheet of paper, now rather battered, and I think you can see this. What this does is it tells you what the gradient for the day is going to be. So you know in advance how far you're going to walk and how steep it's going to be. And for those of us who like to cheat a little, it gives one the opportunity to send luggage on in advance. And the other thing that's really important is my journal, written in every day, written in great detail and treasured by me in my pack. So all the gear a pilgrim needs. Another stone for my shrine. But if I'm truthful, it is much, much harder than I imagined it would be. I don't suppose anything really prepares you for walking 12 miles a day, day after day after day. I thought I'd packed very, very carefully. I had lists, I considered, I knew I didn't want to carry very much, but I really discovered after 3 days of the backpack tango that taking the weight off your feet is absolutely literal and something that needs to be done. And so I've taken all sorts of things out, given them away or sent them home. I don't need all of that in my pack. But the real problem, the problem that is making such a difference to the whole enterprise is the heat. So I decided that I'd walk in September because I thought it would be cooler, but not a bit of it. There's a drought and it hasn't rained for more than 6 weeks. And there's one day, one afternoon, when I stagger into a place called Castel Jerez, and I've been looking like a mirage in the distance at a castle on the hill. And when I finally totter in, the warden, who I have to say looks as though he's come from central casting, long grey hair in a plait, long grey tunic, long grey trousers, but very kind. And he takes my bag and he finds a mattress for me and he puts my bag down. So far, so good. And then later I go on to sit on there's a kind of balcony and I go to sit outside in the hope that it will be cooler. And he comes out and takes the temperature. And although it's nearly 6 o'clock in the afternoon, it is still 37 degrees. And the real problem about the heat, the thing that makes it so difficult to bear, is that heat and feet do not go. And I have got blisters on my blisters. I have never seen so many blisters. There are days when I can hardly walk. Now, I'm not alone in this. This is something that happens to a lot of people, and there's a special kind of blister protocol. I think we could talk about it. So when 2 or 3 are gathered together in a cafe, what you find is that the first thing everybody does is to take their boots off. Then they take their socks off. Then they start poking their feet, examining the damage, readjusting their plasters, getting some ointment out. And then there is a general discussion of blister remedies. So these come in several kinds. The first one I remember being told about was advice who came from one of the most beautiful men I have ever seen. I mean, he was an Italian doctor, and really Michelangelo would have been happy to paint him. And he was an advocate of the needle and thread version of dealing with the blisters. And I'm not so sure about that, because it's all very well, you can sterilize the needle, but you can't sterilize the thread. And I fancied it might make it worse. Now, the Spanish rule generally was iodine for the wounds and a lovely cool liquid called alcohol de romero, which was a kind of smelt of rosemary, and it was very good for hardening the skin on your feet. But my favorite, my absolute favorite, came very early on. And I did a lot of tottering and staggering. Me and Mrs Blister both arrived at a hostel, and very bad time with the feet, really, really unhappy because of it. And there was a very large and friendly woman who was the hostess of the hostel. And she called me over straight away. And the very first thing she did was to relace my boots for me. And then she produced a huge box of medicaments. So she obviously had to do this always, every day, I imagine. And so we didn't have a language in common. So this is all by sign language, but she's doing this and she's anointing my feet and she's bandaging them. And then she did something absolutely surprising. She produced a packet of panty liners. Now, you know, panty liners, the sort of one you put them in your knickers, and they've got little wings on either side that you fold underneath the gusset of your knickers. Just like that, only used on the insole of the boot. And really, really, it does work because they absorb all the sweat. Excellent, excellent way of keeping your feet dry. Although in the end, nothing but nothing really cured the situation. Mrs Blister had a tantrum in Burgos and insisted at great expense that she changed her boots. But it didn't make any difference at all. And some days it was almost impossible to walk. Another stone for the shrine. So, given all of that, you may be asking, why am I doing this? I have to say, Mrs Blister asked me that every bloody day. Why are you doing this? And I'm not sure that I know entirely. What do I know? I know that I've always been fascinated by the Camino, that I've read lots of stuff about it. The very first book I read was an absolutely mad chronicle from Shirley MacLaine, which was full of spiritual guides coming down from space and mad dogs attacking you, and, you know, creatures from outer space, all sorts of nonsense, but intriguing. And then later on, I read much more conservative, small c accounts of the journey, and that really tickled my fancy, I suppose. And then there were also other reasons, other things like coming up to 70, 70 years and 10, biblical allocation of life. What am I going to do with the rest of the time that I have? What does it all mean? I want an adventure. I want to do something. Maybe I want a vision quest. And there was a dream as well. I kept having this dream where I would see myself walking into the far distance with a pack on my back. I never saw my face, but just going along. And in that way, I would think about it and finally decided that I either had to put up or shut up. So if I was going to go, I needed to go, and I needed to go soon. So I found this space in the year. And I suppose I should say as well that I'm not remotely religious, not in any conventional sense. I certainly went to school. I went to church until I was 16 with my family. I went every week. And then when I was 16, I was confirmed. And I think I had high expectations, being a bit of a drama queen then as now. I had high expectations of what this experience would be. I don't know what I expected. Would the heavens open? Would something happen? And what actually happened was that I thought that the bishop did a really, really bad job, and it was very perfunctory. So it's dum-de-dum, 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 laying on of hands. And that was it for me 2 weeks later, and I'd given up the whole thing. And I don't think I've ever really changed my mind, because it seems to me that any kind of organized religion oppresses women and is homophobic. There's so much evidence of all of that. And since that pretty much takes out everybody that I love, I don't think there's any place for me there. And yet, I have retained the most enormous fondness for the King James Bible, which is written in the most spectacularly beautiful English. I love the Messiah. I go to the Messiah every Christmas without fail, and I stand up for the Hallelujah chorus with great glee. And I'm a bugger for a requiem as well, Verdi being the favorite. So there's something there. There's something there. There's a question that I'm still asking. There's something that's important for me. So I guess I have to confess to being a nostalgic atheist. There's a God-shaped hole, that's for certain. Another stone for my shrine. So I've told you quite a lot about what I didn't like. Heat, feet, all of those kind of things, blisters. But there are also things that I liked. I like enormously. I like the simplicity of the day. I like knowing what I'm doing for the whole day. I like the fact that I can get up in the morning in the darkness. I get up, I put my clothes on, I pack my bag by touch, being very, very careful to put things back in the same place so that I don't lose anything. I put my pack on my back and I walk out from darkness into light. And if I'm really lucky and it's a good day, before I get too far, there'll be somewhere for a cup of coffee and maybe even something good to eat. And while I'm having my coffee, I'm probably doing something with my boots and my feet. I consult the books, I have a think about it, and I decide how far I can walk that day and what my destination will be. And I walk on until I get there. And then when I get there, the first thing I do is nab a bunk, preferably one of the lower ones so that I don't have to scramble up everything, because I'm not very good at that. So I get my bunk, I put my bag down, I wash my body, I wash my clothes, I hang my clothes out to dry. I go and do a recce, find out where I am. I come back and I write my journal as much as I can. And then I maybe have a little bit of a nap, a walk around, and then I go for the Pilgrim Supper. Pilgrim Supper's very good news. 9 or 10 euros, really cheap, pretty basic in terms of cooking and a bit repetitive, but keeps you going. And the great thing for those of us who like a glass of wine is that we are in wine country and the wine is fabulous. And there is as much of it as you can drink. So a couple of glasses of wine, off to my bunk, start again the following day. It's all about keeping on, and this sense of focus. And of course, there are also lovely things along the way. So I remember the smell of the herbs And those mornings when I would walk, and as the sun came up, so the moon would still be in the sky behind me, and a sense of absolute magic in watching that sunrise, and I'm pursuing the path and seeing so much beautiful nature. And also, of course, the things I learnt along the way. So, very basic piece of information was that my knees are crap. Absolute crap. And if I get down, I can't get up again without a very undignified performance where I get onto hands and knees and push myself up unless somebody helps me. But a more important lesson, maybe a life lesson, is that I discovered that I really, really have to walk at my own pace. And that the days that I tried to walk at somebody else's speed were disastrous. I flagged, I got exhausted, I got hot, Mrs Blister got cross, it was all a nightmare. So walking at my own pace, and I became accustomed to the young people rushing past me, being full of glee, and off they went doing 30 miles in the day, and I can manage 12 and that's about it. But I learnt that I was the tortoise to their hare, and that I could actually get there in the end. I would always arrive, even if it took me a couple of hours longer. Another stone. And there's something really pleasurable about the stripping away of things. So when I'm in Cardiff in my little house, then I have my routines. I make my cup of coffee in the morning. I come downstairs with it. I put it in a particular cup. I look at my garden and admire my plants while I drink it. I listen to particular things on the radio. I read. I walk in the park. I see friends. There's a whole routine. There's a whole pattern to my life when I'm at home. But here on the Camino, none of those things are present. I have nothing like that I can use or depend on. I have instead to depend absolutely and entirely on myself and my own resources, my own devices. One of the things I decided I could do without, partly to do with weight, but also to do with my dislike of seeing people looking at things through lenses. I have no camera. I brought no camera, but every day when I write in my journal, I describe images that I might have taken. And the first one of those I can think of, there was a day when I saw two priests, Catholic, I presume, in their long black robes, looking rather like crows. And they were being very, very surreptitious. And I was watching them and I thought, what are they doing? And then I realized that they were smoking behind their hands. And then there was a day when I saw a whole field of sunflowers, but not bright yellow sunflowers, black sunflowers rotting on their stalks, presumably waiting to have their seeds collected. And another day, one of the very few grey days when I thought for a moment it might even rain, I was going up a mountain and I could hear this jangly sound ahead of me. And when I got there, I realized there was a whole kind of frieze of metal statues blowing in the wind. And the one that really appealed to me was a kind of pilgrim figure with a large hat and a staff sitting on a donkey. And inevitably, I thought about Don Quixote. And Leon, the cathedral at Leon is really beautiful. And at night, it's lit up and it looked like it lit up with white light. And it looked like a ship floating in the sky. And an image that made me laugh. So blisters. I've talked about blisters, and I'm hobbling into a town lunchtime-ish one day, and coming towards me is a young woman who is absolutely has her feet stuffed into a pair of pink, very high-heeled shoes with peaked toes. She is hobbling. I am hobbling. We exchanged grimaces. Perhaps the most touching photo that I didn't take but wrote about was to do with a lovely French couple who I met along the way. And we had never had much of a conversation. We just passed the time of day, as we say in English. And I was aware of them. They both had really lovely, calm faces, middle-aged people, perhaps older, obviously married and walking together. And they'd come all the way across France. And I really loved watching them. My observation of them had been nothing but pleasurable, because there was something so delightful in their tenderness towards each other. And I'd made an assumption that they would be walking the whole way. And then I bumped into them in Burgos, and it turned out that they were leaving that day and going home because they'd run out of time. And I wanted to tell them, I really, really wanted to tell them how much I admired them, how much I had valued their quiet patience with each other, their loving relationship. And I was so busy trying to put the bloody thing into French that I completely missed the moment. And they'd gone, and we said our goodbyes, and I knew that I would never see them again. And never mind carpe diem. What about seizing the moment? Another life lesson. And it's stupid. It was stupid because it is so, so easy to have conversations with people along the way. Because really, all you have to do is to say, why are you doing this? And they'll tell you. And it will often be quite a profound explanation. And I met some really intriguing people. It's a very strange thing that you could walk with people for a couple of days and see them all the time around every bend, and then they'd somehow disappear and you'd never see them again. So the first person I met, beautiful young Danish girl, Moo, tall, striding out, very long hair, really something about her, very graceful and exuding a kind of innocence. And she was absolutely charming. She spoke immaculate English, and she also was learning Spanish in order to be able to read Marquez in the original language. And she told me that she wanted to walk barefoot. I thought this was a terribly bad idea. I mean, never mind blisters. The road was really, really tough. And I was also anxious about her. I thought, a young woman walking by herself, was she going to be safe? But we discussed it, and that was the last chat we had, and I never saw her again, except that one day, several weeks later, going up a hill, I saw hanging from a tree a pair of boots. And I reached up to them, and they said Mu and the dates and Santiago. So I knew that she had got rid of her boots and was somewhere walking barefoot. Willem was a really nice German man. He was an importer-exporter, fruit, I think. And I met him because he was kind enough to haul me up from the ground when I was having one of my proverbial, how on earth do I get up from here? And Mrs Blister was not cooperating round the knees. And Willem was on his second marriage, and he had a young son, and just in the nature of his life, he was able to spend quite a lot of time with his son because he wasn't working so hard. But the daughter from his first marriage was jealous because she saw her half-brother having attention that she'd never had. And Willem was worried about that and didn't know how to solve that problem. And another day in walking through a wood, and it was the only time I felt really a bit frightened. I wasn't quite sure that I was in the right place, and there was an old farmer who kept driving backwards and forwards, and wasn't happy about that. And also it was a chestnut wood, and this is, you know, harvest time, so when the chestnuts fell off the trees, it felt like shot, and I kept jumping. And then I came round a corner, and there was the most unexpected sight. There was a young man, maybe 30s, pushing an 8 or 9-year-old child in a buggy in front of him on this woodland path. And he was Danish, and we started talking, and it turned out that his son, his name was Simon, and his son's name was Sander, and Sander was autistic. And they were just together walking the last part of the Camino. And Simon was very clear that there was no miracle cure for his son, but he just wanted them to share this experience. And when Sander got wound up and started shouting, Simon would get his phone out and play the child a recording of his mother's voice, and that would soothe him. Another person, Kiyomi, Japanese, walking the Camino for the umpty-tumpth time, academic, perfect English, pretty good Spanish, walked a lot with 3 men who I call the 3 Spanish Musketeers. And she had been commissioned to walk the Camino again and write some kind of academic report about it. But she was absolutely torn by the fact that her Japanese husband, whom she loved very much, in no way shared her wanderlust and had no desire whatsoever to travel. So he was at home in Tokyo, and here she was on the path, and she didn't know how those things were going to work out in the future. And then Irish Gilly. So I was Welsh Gilly, she was Irish Gilly, and we met one day in the ladies in a convent where we were all staying, and I walked in through the door, and she was quite short, and there she was with rollers in her hair. And I thought this was so astonishing that anybody would bring rollers in their rucksack that I burst out laughing at, and we started talking. And Irish Gilly was walking the Camino for the 3rd time. She'd walked first in her early 50s because she wanted to do something for herself. She'd spent her life caring for her husband and her sons, and she wanted to do something alone. And then she'd walked for the 2nd time after her husband died suddenly and unexpectedly. And she'd walked in her grief, and in fact her grief was so severe that she kept falling and hurting herself, so she'd had to give up. And this time she was walking, she said that she was walking into her future, and she decided that on this walk, this time on the Camino, she would decide all the major questions in her life about where to live, whether to have another relationship, what to do. So that was her mission on the trail. And the other person was the aforementioned Hanneke. And Hanneke, Dutch school teacher, and I was very, very slow in working out that Hanneke identified me with her mother, who had died sometime earlier that year, and I was probably the same age. And Hanneke, good God, Hanneke was tenacious. Anywhere I was going, Hanneke was coming too. And being British and rather too polite for my own good, I was finding it really, really difficult to get rid of her in a nice way, until we got to the point where she made a scene in one of the hostels at night. Now the hostels, you got your Pilgrim Passport, you get in, and they cost between €3 and €5 a night. So frankly, in my book, if you're sleeping somewhere that's that cheap, then you can't complain about anything. And we were in a dormitory with 40 people, and inevitably after the lights off, what happens? People start snoring. And on this particular night, I mean, you could have orchestrated it, the snoring was so bad. And Hanneke decided that she was really angry about all of this, and she got out of her bunk and she started shaking the bunks of the people who were snoring, and then she pulled her mattress out and made an exit, by which time, of course, she had very, very kindly admitted everybody in the room to her own trauma, so that everybody managed to wake up the remaining 39 people. And when I saw her the following morning, she clearly expected me to be sympathetic, and I wasn't a bit. And I discussed the situation with Irish Gilly, and she said to me, Gilly, this is your Camino. You will never see these people again. It's too important. You do what you want to do. And the learning from this, the learning was this: on a walk like that, the amount of time you spend with other people, that experience is inevitably very short. So ultimately, any meeting you have, any encounter that you have, is really an encounter with yourself. More stones. And I couldn't get away from the sense that the walking the Camino was a metaphor for the journey of life. I know it's a bit trite, but that's what it felt like. And there was all this sense all the time of it being like throwing the dice and seeing what happens if you got a 6, because I know that if I do that walk again, it would be completely different. I would meet different people. I would stay in different hostels. It would all depend on heat, feet, meetings, timings, all those kind of things. And it would be different. It would be as though the dice had been thrown and something else had happened. And I was delighted in a place called Logrono, that on the main Pilgrim Street, etched into the pavement, was something that looked like a game of snakes and ladders, only in this instance, there were geese. Don't quite understand why. And also you could tell from it that there were landmarks that you met along the way. So I love the fact that my sense of this game of chance, this metaphor for the journey of life, was being laid out on the pavement. And I allowed myself a fantasy, which I shared with Mrs Blister, that when I finally got to Santiago, when I went to the Pilgrim Mass, the game of chance would mean that everybody I had met on the way would be present in that service. Shrine stone. However, back to Las Herrerias, and it's still day 35, and good God, what a day it's been, and nothing has been cheery about it. Mrs Blister's been in a filthy temper all day, and I really had to stop her. She wanted to tell all these mountain bikers coming past us and shouting "Buen Camino" as they went, and heaved a load of shale in your face as they whizzed past. And it was very difficult for Mrs Blister not to tell them to fuck off as they went. And she'd also been doing a lot of ranting about bleeding Jesus iconography, too much gold, who paid for this, what are the politics of it's the poor that pay, blah, de, blah, de, blah. So we were both upset, angry, pissed off, tired, homesick, and desperately, desperately wanting to go home. But fortunately, tomorrow is another day, and the sun was shining. And this refugio, this hostel, happened to be a place where for once they were actually prepared to give you some breakfast. And I was in their kitchen waiting eagerly for my cup of coffee. And there were lots of things on the walls everywhere. And so looking around, my eye here, my eye there, photographs, pictures. And then suddenly I was drawn to something in English, poetry in English. And it said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." And for me, that was, I don't know, a kind of ooh moment, something powerful. I knew it was T.S. Eliot. I didn't know what or where it was from, and I discovered later that it's near the end of the last Little Gidding, which is the last of the 4 quartets. But something about reading these words was very powerful. And I'd managed to organize myself in such a way that first of all, I'd been really, really firm with Hanneke and said, today I walk by myself. And I'd also had a good look at the map and seen that the gradient was like that. So I sent my luggage on in advance, and I was literally unencumbered. And it was beautiful, such a beautiful walk, up and up and up. Indeed, it was really, really steep, but the sun was shining and there were lots of trees, and there was a kind of chiaroscuro through the trees, through the leaves onto the ground below, making beautiful patterns. And there was something about the geography that meant that as I went on and looked back behind me, I could see the road curving away and looping down back into the valley. And something about that was lovely. And as I was walking, it was getting greener and greener, because I was coming into Galicia, and Galicia is quite a lot like Wales. It's grey, the stoneware is grey, and there's lots of greenery. And I'd been thinking about my mother, and earlier on the journey on the Camino, I'd thought about my parents with warmth, and I'd been able to go into a church and light a candle for them with gratitude. But on this day, I was thinking about my mother, and my mother and I had a very difficult relationship. So I was thinking about her, and that was making me feel sad. And then I found myself walking along a grey stone, dry stone wall. And as I came round the bend, there was a sign. There was a village in front of me, and there was a sign, and the sign said El Sobrero, the name of the town, village, and underneath it said, has been welcoming pilgrims for more than 900 years. And I started to cry. I started to weep from the bottom of my stomach. I wept and I was weeping. And despite the fact that just at that moment, in a completely incongruously, a large coach drew up and a whole party of Japanese tourists came out, cameras, all the bit. It didn't matter. And I walked on into the village itself, and I couldn't stop crying, and I was looking for somewhere to go, somewhere just to get over this emotional outburst. And I was very fortunate, because I went into a church, and it was a simple one. It was plain. There was no stained glass. And St. James in his statue was human, because the legend of St. James along the Camino is that he was one of Jesus' disciples, but that he came to Spain and defeated the Moors. And so there are really hideous, and I mean hideous, statues of St. James with a sword in one hand and his feet on dead black men. I mean, just disgusting. But this, fortunately, was a peaceful St. James, a wooden statue, long blue robe, his staff, his scallop shell. And then in another corner of the church, there was a Virgin Mary who was similarly simple, blue robe, no baby, just standing there. And I went and I sat and I cried and cried until I could actually stop. And then I left the church, and on the way out, I managed to collect a pilgrim poem that was actually had been translated into English, and seemed to tell you something like, if you're not changed by this experience, there's something wrong. And I went outside and I walked along, and I found Irish Gilly sitting in front of a cafe place, and she had a little earthenware bowl full of wine. And I went and got one myself and sat down with her, and we were talking, and she noticed that I'd been crying, and she said, what's wrong? Why have you been crying? And I said, oh, I was thinking about my mother and it made me sad. And she said, oh, was she a lovely woman then? And I said, no. And that was sort of it for the day in a way. And we walked on together, and Irish Gilly had more stamina than me, and she walked on further and got a better hostel. And I arrived at a hostel which I didn't like, felt a bit buggy and grubby. And also I was mortified by the fact that the woman who was in charge looked absolutely downtrodden and miserable. And I thought, she probably hates pilgrims. She probably hates them day after day. And I went to my bed. I'd got a bottom bunk. And I lay there, I couldn't sleep. And I thought about Irish Gilly's question. Was she a lovely woman then? And I also thought about the weeping. What did that mean? What was that about? And I was very clear. It wasn't a religious experience. Wasn't anything like that, but somehow it was a moment of grace, a reminder that sometimes it's wonderful to be alive. And the next day, hallelujah, not the next day, but 5 days later, so 40 days in all, significance not missed. 40 days later, 40 days altogether, 5 days later, I arrive finally in Santiago, and I get there and I discover that, of course, the cathedral is not right on the edge of the town, and you have to walk through the whole city to get there. And fortunately, I was encouraged by nice Spaniards shouting out cheery words of, you'll get there and it's all fine and whatever. So I finally got to the cathedral. The cathedral is immense and very, very foreboding. It's dark. It's got a whole fleet of stairs up the front, black and rather unpleasant. And I wanted to go into the cathedral. I just wanted to actually take a moment and cherish and celebrate the fact that I had walked my 500 miles, that I had wanted to do this, and I had got there. And I went into the church. And there was no peace to be had anywhere. Even the bit that was marked for private prayer was being swarmed over by people with cameras and, the whole kit and caboodle. So that was not at all useful. I had no desire to go and peer at St. James's relics. So I came out again. And what I did instead, which was more useful, was that I went and I collected my Compostela. Now, you're not going to be able to see this properly, but this is my certificate. This is me producing my Pilgrim Passport and showing that I have walked the whole way and all the dates. And here is my certificate made out in my name. And something about it made me cry, of course, because that was the moment when I thought, I have got here. I have done this. I don't know what it means, but I've arrived. And that afternoon, Kiyomi and I went to the Pilgrim Mass, which happens every day, and we positioned ourselves really carefully because the big event in the Pilgrim Mass is that they swing this huge incense holder right across the cathedral. And we really wanted to see that. So we're right there. We've got a very good view. And of course, it turns out that that's the day that the monks are taking off. So it didn't happen. But never mind. Mr. Briley had done me one final good turn with his guidebook in that he had suggested a small hotel with a garden. And I felt at this stage of the proceedings, 40 nights on, that I could actually treat myself to a hotel. So I did that. Me and Mrs. Blister had a really good time, clean shower, clean sheets, great, good night's sleep. And the following day, I did something that I had definitely allowed time for, which was to go to Finisterre. Finisterre, the end of the land. And in the legend of St. James, this is the place where he landed in Spain. And what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go as a pilgrim and cast your clothes into the water. Well, I thought that was going a bit far, really. I didn't feel any need to cast my clothes, but I did actually abandon my walking poles very tidily in a bin because they were absolutely knackered from 500 miles of walking. But the thing about Finisterre, and I can't be snotty about this, because if you've been to Land's End in England, you will know what I'm talking about. Finisterre was full of tat. just tables and tables of awful things, cheap and nasty. But there was one thing that I really liked, and that was that I found on one of the tables, I told you about the stamp in the Pilgrim Passport, and an imitation stamp that said game over. And because of my feeling that the whole game of life thing, the whole game of chance, it made me laugh, and I brought it with me. And that evening, my last evening, I met Irish Gilly for a meal, and we sat together and talked, and she outlined for me what was going to be her 3-point plan for the future and all the decisions that she had made along the way. And I felt very happy for her. And when we said goodbye, we just had one of those moments, one of those special moments where we hugged each other, and we acknowledged in that embrace that we had shared something really important, and that we would never see each other again in this life. And that was it. The next morning, I got up at the crack of dawn. I went to the airport. I got a plane, Ryanair, for God's sake, most ungracious way of traveling. Ryanair to London, coach from London to Cardiff. And as if something, I don't know what had happened. It was as though suddenly it was all over. And I'm back in my little house. I've written in my diary every day for 40 days. And suddenly I can't write anymore, and it's finished. And I'm tired. The only thing that's noticeably different is that I've lost a lot of weight, but I'm really confused. I don't know whether it meant anything or nothing, or whether I should be writing something else about it or squirreling away for more meaning. I mean, after all, the only writing on the wall belonged to T.S. Eliot. So what was it all about? I'd hoped to come home with some clear guidance for the future. And yet, maybe I was just an old woman who'd been on a very long walk and was making a big fuss about it. And yet, all these years later, this is a part of my life that haunts me. This is something that I think about, that stays in my memory in vivid detail, that offers me clues and no answers. And yet, this I do know, that if I had the chance, despite not understanding what it's about, I would go again tomorrow. Perhaps not there, but on some long walk. I would pick up my pack. I would take my poles. I would pack carefully, and I would start walking westwards with the sun behind me, walking into my future, walking, of course, towards my death.
Thank you, Gilly. Thank you so much. I think everybody is clapping in their rooms.
Thank you so much, Gilly. Thank you. I'm sobbing here.
Oh.
I think it's okay if people want to put their audio on and clap or say something.
Thank you, Gilly.
Gilly.
Thank
Gilly.
you. Bravo.
Gracias, gracias.
Gracias, hermoso.
Got my glass of wine.
Very good.
Oh, well
Cheers.
deserved.
If there are any questions, people can ask them in the chat, or well, if you would take questions, Gilly, I don't know. If you,
Yeah, if there's anything anybody wants to ask, that's fine.
yeah, I would just like to say, I feel like I need to thank you for walking the Camino for me. I don't need to do it.
Fiesta la Kevin.
Gilly, it's Jamie.
Oh, hi, Jamie.
I'm just pissed off that you didn't send me a postcard from that walk.
Oh, I'm sorry. Nobody much got a postcard.
This is the postcard.
Yeah, this is the postcard. Yeah.
It's all late.
I just have remembered too that we have a translator here now with us. This is Eugenia, and she is going to go into the translation channel and translate to Spanish. So if there's anybody here that would like Spanish translation for the rest of the evening, you can click in the lower part of the window on the button for going into the translation channel, and Eugenia will tell you this now in Spanish.
Ahorita se va a hacer un subgrupo para la traducción en español. Las personas que quieran traducir se puede, nada más tienen que pincharle allí ahorita que aparezca el subgrupo. Sale ahí, estaré traduciendo las personas que gusten. Me clear, it's okay, my micro, yeah, it's okay.
Okay, so we have the Spanish translation functioning now.
Nobody's doing a video. Just these people. Yeah.
Just getting a chair.
Okay. I'll just cancel Gilly's spotlight. We are actually a little bit over time already, but that's okay because we have a nice evening ahead of us. We can keep talking to Gilly, and we can also segue into the next part of the evening. But just in case people need a little break? Does anybody feel like they need to stand up and stretch or move around a little bit before we carry on? Okay, Dawn needs to get another coffee. I'm just going to play Sandra Pacini's song again to give everyone a bit of time to just readjust and share, and please feel free to ask questions or make comments in the chat. And I'll just let us listen to this special Magdalena song that we have from Sandra Pacini.
Donne che mi toccano il cuore, che mi stringono le mani, che mi fanno pensare, che mi segnano strade, che mi dicono vai, mi dicono sei, puoi, devi, ora alza lo sguardo e non ti fermare, sopra il fuoco tu puoi volare e nessuno ci può spaventare, nessuno ci può ignorare, nessuno, dico nessuno ci può rubare il canto e il sorriso, neanche col viso sfregiato, neanche col viso coperto, e corri come una lupa, abbraccia la sposa bambina, rapisci il tempo, un tempo rubato da sempre, un tempo di forza, un tempo rubato da sempre. E chino la testa al fiore bambino, sussurro ali di pino, tocco la terra e un tempo rubato da sempre, un tempo di forza, un tempo rubato da sempre. E sfido gli occhi di chi non mi vede, assaggio il fiore felino, strappo parole dal sole. Alza lo sguardo e non ti fermare, sopra il fuoco tu puoi volare e nessuno ci può